Thanks, Dan. So, Aniin Degwagi Indigenous Cause, Ushkikamang and Donjaba, Washa Shikan Dodem. My name is Autumn, and I'm from Curve Lake First Nation. And Martin is my clan. And I'm honored to sit in the circle here with Imaan and Mandy today. And currently, I take on the role as the Director of Programs here at IDHC. So, hello, Lorraine. So today we're going to speak about two beautiful initiatives. One is the cost of COVID-19 that we launched from April 20th to October 20th, 21st, which then led into the Aki Giminuguna Mishkozewin, which translates to The Land Gives Us Strength, which we started delivering in March 2021 through to currently. So whoever is sharing their screen, Chumigwach for that. Thanks, Jess. So I don't know what our cue will be for us to shift over to the next screen.
Next slide, please.
There you go. All right. So the cost of COVID was a team effort. So similar to Emerita Roy presentation there, there was lots of active community involvement. So we had an academic team made up of Dr. Imaan Bayoumi, Dr. Eva Perky, and Colleen Davidson. What was beautiful is that Queen's University seconded myself over to the Department of Family Medicine as the Indigenous Research Associate. And we worked with an oversight committee who was made up of Dion Nolan, Jennifer Kehoe, Sheldon Travis, and Dan Mitchell. And these individuals, community members, were appointed from the now known as Indigenous Wellness Council, formerly known as the Indigenous Health Council out of Kingston. And the oversight committee was there to really provide us with data governance, to assist us with interpreting the data, as well as ensuring that we held true to the OCAP principles. Next slide, Jess. So in terms of Indigenous data sovereignty and adherence to OCAP, what was really important is we wanted to have, and Christopher Simmons, he actually puts this quite eloquently, is that we wanted to equally share community and university research voice and power in all phases of the research process. So it began with community engagement through to recruitment, to the appointment of, the Indigenous Health Council. We even had a response circle that was set up in the community where we could take some of the findings from the research to community to begin to mobilize and action this research. Next slide, Jess. Imaan?
Yeah, thanks, Autumn. So the overall objectives of the research were to study the impacts of the social and emotional impacts of the pandemic, and particularly the public health measures that were taken to try to control the pandemic on urban Indigenous peoples. So it won't come as a surprise to this audience that that around 60% of Indigenous peoples in Canada live in urban settings, but that there aren't very many resources that are allocated to Indigenous peoples in that context. And so we also wanted to study the impacts of the pandemic on service delivery. So in order to do that, we used a multi-method approach and had three data streams. So the first was we had a quantitative survey that was disseminated, and Autumn was instrumental in reaching out to community members to encourage them to participate, which made a huge impact on the willingness of people to respond to the survey. And I can't I can't emphasize that enough. It's just it's a totally different process when there's a community member who people trust and know, who's inviting them to participate in this research, and people have much greater faith in the validity of the process and the importance of the process. So those surveys looked at a number of different things. Certainly we captured demographic data, but we also looked at impacts of the pandemic on some social determinants like housing, food security, employment, intimate partner violence, and then access to services as well. And we had some questions embedded around mental health and around the importance of spirituality and access to culture. So in addition to the surveys, we had in total 263 Indigenous respondents. So this project was part of a larger project, but the 263 is the self-identified Indigenous respondents to the survey. We had a second stream where we collected these brief stories that people had a number of prompts, and they could share a story that was important to them in relation to COVID, and then they are asked some follow-up questions to do some initial sort of interpretation of their story. And there were 29 stories that were collected from Indigenous people, and then finally we had a third arm of the study, which was service provider interviews. So we engaged with a number of different service providers whose services were focused on Indigenous peoples, and it was Autumn who completed those interviews as well. Next slide, please. So we have a lot of material we could present, but I'm going to present it very briefly. But there were 4 themes that came up repeatedly throughout the research, and I think they align very nicely with what Amrita has just presented, actually. So the first was the lack of infrastructure and community, sort of working to fill in those gaps by engaging in volunteerism. The second was that there were service interruptions at multiple levels. Again, these data were collected in the first year of the pandemic, and so none of these things will be a surprise to you. Those service interruptions and all of the lockdowns and everything created many access barriers. And as a consequence, there was innovation and adaptation that happened in important and interesting ways that I think are lessons that we want to, that are worth bringing forward. And as Amrita has also pointed out, many of these problems preceded COVID, but were intensified during the pandemic. Next slide, please. So the lack of infrastructure in an urban context like our region, there is relatively little local institutional infrastructure. And what infrastructure there are a few organizations that are Indigenous focused or Indigenous governed. Those that exist often have somewhat precarious funding and unstable funding. And so there was difficulty that created difficulties for people in terms of accessing effective and culturally safe programs. And so to fill those gaps, volunteers, community members step in to help their neighbors, their community, the people who they identify as community, and step in to try and fill those gaps. So this quote highlights that. We don't have a friendship center. We don't have a place where we can actually go and sit and say, I need this, or help me find this. So in navigating through all of the different agencies to find which agency best supports the need that you currently have. Next slide, please. And as has already been highlighted, and as everyone will remember, there were lots and lots of service interruptions during those early days of the pandemic, and that included both, sort of health services, social services, etc. But as Amrita also identified, importantly, cultural gatherings, ceremonial gatherings, language gatherings were interrupted, and that was associated with significant challenges in terms of both physical, mental, and spiritual health, and people feeling isolated from community and from culture. Some places where that was particularly highlighted was in healing and treatment facilities, which were at maximum capacity. Shelters also maxed out. Food and housing insecurity dramatically worsened. And I think if we did this study now, we would also be seeing that now, as we sort of go into these difficult economic days. And people who are dealing with loss and grief were really doubly isolated, and found that interruption of community kind of gatherings to be very challenging. And so this quote highlights that. If the work was hard before COVID, the work is double time hard now, just helping people to understand, because, you know, healing and trauma and all those things we have to address, it doesn't help that we're in a pandemic and that there already was no housing. There already is no resource for, there are already no resources for addictions the way that we need them to be. Next slide. And access barriers. So lots and lots and lots of feedback on the challenges with people having insufficient access to technology, poor connectivity. Everybody was trying to use the technology at home, and there just wasn't the bandwidth to meet the needs of the whole household. So that was big. And then people were fearful if they needed support. Sometimes they were afraid to reach out. And so one individual said, "I don't have food to feed my children, but is Children's Aid going to come and take my children?" So it puts people in this really challenging double bind. Next slide. And I think that's over to you, Autumn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what we found is that the community really adapted to the pandemic. You know, there was a lot of program successes, but most importantly, culture was extremely significant. So as you can see in the middle, there's some stats there. So before COVID, there was this gravitation or importance of spirituality around, 56%, which doubly heightened during the pandemic to 76 percent, really leaned in and found it important to benchmark on spirituality. So of no surprise, we've seen it throughout Indigenous territory all across Ontario. The urban community there in Kingston picked up, started beating circles. We couldn't have a community come and plant tobacco seeds. So those tobacco seeds were then forwarded out to communities. So individuals could take care of their own health by planting their own medicine gardens. And just as importantly, Indigenous language really became critically important. Next slide, Jess. So we see that, culture became a strength-based response, and it really circled around ceremony, the relationship to others in the community, as well as the land, the importance of language and land base. So even though, individuals were physically distanced, they found ways to gather. So there in Kingston, community came together for full moon ceremonies, water ceremonies, and language. I guess if we just want to follow the circle in terms of, the relations. So, prior to COVID, everyone sang and danced and shared. We honored gatherings where an opportunity to feel connected to the land and the people of the program. Another really vital quote that came out of the research was that language is really essential to cultural well-being. So there's a whole language of grief that's in that language. There's ceremonial language and cultural practices. And this land-based, it was humbling for some of the participants. It was humbling to see some Indigenous families not having to be in the colonial structure of schools. They were connected to the land. They were going back to our traditional ways of how we teach our young. So culture, of course, became quite evident. Next slide, Jess. So the results highlighted the need to include, create space, fund, and recruit. So develop those meaningful partnerships with community, but really creating that safe space, within a non-Indigenous based organization, as Imaan had alluded to earlier. There's not much Indigenous infrastructure in the Cataraqui region. Most importantly, increase and secure funding for holistic Indigenous-led programs throughout the region that are sustainable. And of course, recruit, hire, and retain Indigenous service providers to be able to improve system access, navigation, and service coordination. And the importance of having a gathering space solely for the Indigenous community. Next slide, Jess. Which then led into an event. Actually, I think this is your slide, Imaan.
Okay, thanks. So one of the things that was very important to us was not just to collect this data, but to ensure that the data went back to the community. And so in order to do that, to share the results with the community, we organized this event last October, so just over a year ago, that we called Indigenous Strength, Braiding Culture, Ceremony, and Community. It was a knowledge dissemination circle. It was conducted outside because of, it was a shifting landscape in terms of COVID precautions at the time. It was opened in a traditional fashion by Grandmother Kate Brandt. And we had a number of students who had worked with us over the summer. They presented their results verbally, and also they had infographics that were on display. And the whole event we shared a land-based feast. And I just think it was just a very important time to have that kind of give and take, to people could hear the results and reflect on them. I think they really appreciated hearing that. I know that for the students as well, it was highly educational and very instructive, that whole process of what do we do with research and how do we make it come alive and be meaningful to community members. Next slide, please. So, we always want to be able to action the results of research. It's very important that research not just be just there and inactive and sitting on a shelf. So we were very fortunate. There was a call from the CIHR, which is the National Health Research, the biggest health funder in Canada. And they had a specific call for knowledge dissemination projects that could action COVID-related work that related to Indigenous people's experience during COVID. And so we thought this was a great opportunity to build on the results and to try to actually create programming to respond to some of the needs that had been identified in the cost of COVID study. And so that process was led by IDHC, and IDHC was the lead on the grant. And we were very fortunate we got the grant. But the grant was a partnership between IDHC, the same Queen's researchers who had worked on the initial project, and then the Kingston Indigenous Languages Nest. And we decided to focus primarily on Indigenous food sovereignty. Next slide, please. So the team for the follow-on project, that is the Ki Gimagona Mishkozawin. So the team on that project, as I said, includes includes people from Kiln. So Mandy's here to discuss the implementation of the project, and I'm excited for you to hear her. Constance Carrier-Prill is the executive director at Kiln. And then in this project as well, we also have an oversight circle represented by Dion Nolan, again, Jennifer Kehoe. Those two folks were also on the oversight on the cost of COVID study, but we have two new members, Lindsay Pillen and Linda Giroux. And then we have some community cultural supports and those people are grandmother Kate Grant and Kevin Kunkel. As I said, the Queen's researchers are the same as the other project, and IDHC is represented by Autumn, who's here today, and Jessica, who's very generously supporting us with the slides. Next slide. So, as I said, the objectives here were to share knowledge from the cost of COVID study while supporting Indigenous food sovereignty, to build related skills and awareness around cultural protocols and self-care, and importantly, to build capacity within an Indigenous-led organization to develop and deliver culturally grounded programming, and then to conduct a program evaluation to see how participation contributed to wellness and the development of a sustainable program to facilitate access to traditional foods. Next slide, please. So there were three components of the program that Mandy's going to tell you about in more detail. The first was foraging walks, second was community gardens, and the third was creation of personal bundles, with the overarching goal of the program in being to promote Bimodzoin. So that's the Anishinaabe word for well-being. And so that in terms of promoting Bimodzoin, the hope was that it would improve participants' mental well-being, their cultural identity, their connection to community, and their connection to land. Next, and I'll pass it over to Mandy.
Ani Bojo, Mandy Indigenous Cause. My name is Mandy. I'm currently the Community Connections Coordinator at Kiln, which is just a long fancy tongue twister to say that I facilitate these programs. Before I talk about the programs, I just want to say that I am very grateful to be here with such amazing people doing such amazing work in the community. And I'd also like to stress how all of these projects have been supported by various different organizations within the community. It's an extremely community-led project. So community has done what community has done best, what they do best, and that is come together to solidify as well as promote these projects. And there's three programs within the Aki project. The first one being community foraging during forest walks. There's a building raised garden beds part of it. And then there's also a building your bundles program. So next slide and I'll explain those. So the foraging walks have been facilitated with the help of a group called the Bell Island Caretakers Circle, which is a group of non-Indigenous and Indigenous people who have come together to enact land stewardship over a small island in Kingston called the Bell Island. We've also had help from local elders and knowledge keepers and just overall plant enthusiasts who are really interested in sharing knowledge about plants. So when we come together for these foraging walks, we focus on learning about edible plants and the medicines growing around the Kingston area. So we always try to gather in a good way on either in public parks or local trails and try to make it as accessible as possible to people. So we never forage on private property or places that people don't have access to with a bus route. Another part of the foraging walks is that we always focus on concepts like Indigenous concepts of things like all my relations, the honorable harvest, and we really try to create reciprocal relationships with nature and with the plant beings. We also, again, encourage land stewardship and community involvement within these foraging walks. We try to express how important it is for us as individuals to become involved with nature and that we are not separated from nature. We are part of nature and need to follow suit by taking care of it. Next slide, please. So the first part of the foraging walks is we usually gather together and we focus on education and identification around our plant relations. So we try to learn the original and traditional names in Anishinaabe-Moan and Genyin-Geha. We learn about the identifying characteristics, the leaf shapes, if there's any colorings or there's any sort of structure that we need to know about the plant. And we also learn about the lookalikes, if there's any toxic lookalikes or anybody who might be trying to deceive us when it comes to gathering the plants. Another part of the education and identification is we learn how to give back and also take care of those plant relations. So whether that's learning not to harvest too much or, you know, going back to that same area and guaranteeing that there's going to be a next generation of the plant by planting seeds, or if it's just just generally taking care of our plant relations and communicating in a good way. Next slide, please. The second part of the foraging walks, which is probably one of my favorites, is the harvesting and preparing part. And what we try to do is we try to focus on harvesting in safe places, because with pollution, we always have to be mindful of where we're harvesting from and where we're gathering from the land. And then we also follow honorable harvest guidelines. And I always call them guidelines versus rules, because I find that rules are a little bit too harsh. But some of those guidelines might be, you never take the first, you never take the last, you never take more than you need. We always express how when you gather something within the community, it's always good protocol to offer to elders, women and children, and people who don't physically have the ability to go out and forage in their own way. We prepare the food usually in the kitchen here at Kiln or on the land with our little tiny red camp stove. And then we spend a lot of time sharing about the plants and learning together. These photos here at the bottom, we have different meals that we've prepared. The first one is a full meal that we did in the summer of dandelion head fritters and a summer salad. And then a lot of people don't know, but you can actually eat the whole heads of sunflowers. So we've got some sunflowers there. And then the third picture is of a little girl trying sumac lemonade for the first time. And we promote things like sumac lemonade because they're really, really good at mitigating the effects of diabetes, things like swelling and high blood sugar and things like that. So those are some of the foods that we work with. Next slide, please. Garden beds, yes. Okay, so next we have the garden beds part of the programs. And there's 3 main garden locations and more than 9 garden beds that have been built to house food, medicinal plants, and pollinators. And there's a large focus on indigenous plants and medicines, as well as creating good relationships within the gardens. We do a lot of succession planting, and we do a lot of like planting with things together. I'll definitely give you the lemonade recipe. So the 3 different locations are the Indigenous Food Sovereignty Garden, kind of known as Highway 15. So that's what it's written here as. We have Teepee Moza Iron Homes, which is a 17-unit transitional housing project that is available to Indigenous people who have either struggled with being unhoused or have been unhoused for quite some time. And then the third location is City Park. Next slide, please. So the garden on Highway 15 is probably the biggest garden that we have. It's about 2.5 acres, and it's open to everybody and anybody who wants to come learn about planting, wants to learn about garden care, watering, little forest care. It's Indigenous led. I'm actually the garden coordinator there. So we do a lot of Three Sisters garden, again, this is succession planting. We do companion planting and things like that. And we focus a lot on permaculture, which is putting something in a space where it's going to stay there and create a permanent habitat for bugs, animals, anything else that might be wanting to live there. This whole thing isn't completely volunteer based. I'm the only person who is employed there. So all of the people that you see in these photos are all people who want to be there and who love being on the land. It's been a great place to bond. It's been a space that anybody can go to at almost any time and just get access to the land, which has been a great thing. Next slide. Oh, back one. There we go. Yeah, there we go. So another thing with the Indigenous Food Sovereignty Garden is it's also a place where we do a lot of our on the land programming. So we hold some of those foraging walks as well as ceremonies at this location. And it's become a place to seek community well outdoors. And we also, we have a lot of on the land programs where people can learn about, like they can learn fire teachings, they can learn how to braid sweetgrass and all kinds of things like that. So we do lots and lots of on the land programs at this location. And then all of the food that is grown at this location either goes to the food distributing hub, which is in like at Kiln here, or it goes to the quarterly ceremonies that we hold, which end up going back into the community. So that's where all of the food goes. Next slide. And then now we have raised garden beds. I think, yeah, still in raised garden beds, sorry. So the next raised garden beds is at Teepee Moza. And this garden bed was built by the residents who wanted to volunteer with Loving Spoonful as well. Ayla from Loving Spoonful has been a great partner in a lot of these programs. And Kiln, of course, was building these gardens. So we planted 3 raised garden beds, one specifically for medicine, and then one for food, and then one specifically for pollinators, where there's a mix of pollinators in a bunch of the other ones. All of these plants were chosen by the residents, and they're all cared for by the residents themselves. And it's a great opportunity to learn things like seed saving, lawn care, plant care, and also how to care for our medicines. So that's one of my favorite spots to go. It's a beautiful garden. Next slide. Now, the last garden, which I am very, very proud to announce, and this is very close to my heart, is at City Park. And at City Park, we have placed 4 colored planters in the colors and directions of the medicine wheel. And this is to reclaim space, but also allow access to medicines and public education around the importance of Indigenous plants and medicines, because plants that are native to a region are the most drought tolerant and the best for that region, that use the least amount of water and the least amount of energy to grow. So we use this place as a place to educate people on the importance of Indigenous medicines and the importance of having that representation as well. And another thing about this location is that in the center where you see that base, it used to hold the Sir Johnny MacDonald statue, which for Indigenous people in this community has caused a lingering colonial energy over this space. So what we're hoping for is that instead of people walking by and seeing that empty space and thinking about the legacy of colonialism, that they'll walk by this space, see those 4 planters, and then see themselves represented within a community and know that this is a safe space and it's no longer being haunted by that colonial legacy. Next slide, please. Yes. The third part of the programs is bundle building, and bundles within many Indigenous communities are a series of teachings and items that you carry. They could be ceremonial items, they could be teachings for mental well-being or health, or just plant teachings and things like that. And they're just, for each individual person, they're very different. So it's just things that you can carry throughout your life to become that valued member of your community, and to it solidifies your kind of like your self-identity within the community as well. So it's a very important part of just indigeneity in general, of those ways of seeing, being, knowing, and understanding. So there's 2 parts of the bundle building workshop. The first is the making and learning workshops, where we make and learn about these items. And then there's the second, which is a community ceremony, where we usually come together with these items and use them in a good way during these ceremonies. Next slide. Yeah, so for the making and learning part, they're generally cultural items and cultural teachings. We learn about the teachings, we learn about language related to them. So just an example, we did feast bundles not that long ago, and we learned about how to say bowl and knife, and Deb St. Amant did a very beautiful just explanation of the point of feast bundles and how they're really, really good for limiting waste and caring for Mother Nature and all the importances of the feast bundles. So we learned about that. And then the next bundle building workshop we did was actually the ceremony, where everybody got to come together and use their feast bundles in a good way. Next slide. So yeah, these are the community ceremonies, and these community ceremonies I find are the best way to foster cultural connections and self-confidence when it comes to personal identity. It helps promote spiritual well-being. We do lots of singing, drumming, dancing. There's sacred fires. One of my favorite pictures is that second one there. That's Jamie Blondin from the Sexual Assault Center teaching the little girls in front of her how to use a smudge kit. So there's lots of bonding, there's lots of teachings that go on. And of course, we always have tons of food sharing. So all of the food that's on that table there all came from the Indigenous Food Sovereignty Garden here in Kingston. Next slide.
Mandy, we're getting close. I'm on to you. We got about a minute or so left.
Okay, I just want to go through a few of these quotes real quick, because I find that they reflect the way that the program is really going. But yeah, one of them is, I can never seem to work in my own garden, but I love coming here to get involved. And this is a woman who experiences a lot of social anxiety and doesn't like going out around people. But when it comes to the garden, she loves being around people. Next slide. It gives me something I can teach and pass on to my daughters that really means something. And this came from a gentleman who lost contact with his daughters over the pandemic. And these bundle building workshops that he learns about, he can then take to his daughter, and then those become bonding moments for them to reconnect with. Next slide. Staying busy, going for walks, and cooking is how I stay away from alcohol. I think this one pretty much speaks for itself, but we are creating environments where people can stay away from those bad habits and stay away from addiction and keep themselves mentally safe and mentally sober. Last slide. And then this one, I don't have access to a garden, so this is a great way to get my hands dirty and fresh veggies. Within the Indigenous culture, especially when you're living in city areas, we don't have access to land and we don't get a lot of access to fresh fruits and vegetables. So this has been a great way to distribute those things within the community. And then the last quote is from a woman who, when I was putting the planters at City Park. Next slide. Yeah, my parents were ashamed of their heritage. It's really nice to see people picking the torch back up again. Me and this woman actually had a very strong heart to heart where we cried together because she was so happy and so proud that although the heritage and culture was stripped from her, that she gets to see the young people pushing that back out into the community. But with that, yeah, I'll just say miigwech bizindawage. Thank you all for listening, and I apologize for taking up so much time. I could talk forever about these programs because I'm loving it here. So yeah, thank you.